Welcome to the next episode of the Breakthrough Autism podcast. I am so happy to have with me here today Dr. Jess Cauchi from Atlas Consulting, also faculty at Brock University. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thrilled to have you here, and particularly because of your background. You address areas that are in dire need of being addressed for the autism community and beyond developmental disabilities that parents, adults, teens really need support in, and yet we don't have enough people doing it. Namely, skills in sexuality. This is such an important area that deserves a lot of attention. I know a lot of the work that you do goes beyond that, and we'll talk about that too. But this area in particular, I'm excited to have you on the show to talk about. It's an area that me personally as a clinician, I get a lot of questions about from families and clients alike in our community. And, you know, commonly what comes up is, I don't know what to do. My child is getting into puberty, or my child is a teenager, full into puberty, or even beyond, interested in relationships and beyond. And there's nowhere to turn in terms of help for our community of individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. So here you are. I'm really happy to be sharing this with our audience, tips and an understanding into this world. So to start with, what do you want people to know about this area when it comes to individuals with autism, sexuality? What's the most important thing that we need to think about just to kick things off?
I like that. I mean, I think a lot of things are really important, so I will try to narrow down.
Yeah.
But I think if I had to pick, especially in terms of our community, it's there's no getting around this.
Yes.
And so, you know, everybody I know that works in sexuality with individuals on the spectrum or other developmental disabilities, this isn't really where anybody started their career. We all sort of landed here because of necessity. And so I think, you know, the easiest things are to think about, you're not going to avoid teaching in some of these areas. And so the earlier we can start thinking about these things, the earlier we can start planning for them, even if we're not teaching, you know, yet. But being mindful of that, starting to think about it, starting to be prepared, starting to set some goals in some of these areas will make it so much easier later on. You know, once we're talking about adolescents and adults, it's much harder. It's not impossible, but it's much harder, right? If we can start thinking about how do we teach skills in sexuality, which is such a broad area, early, it will just make it so much easier for everybody going forward.
Absolutely. I really love that you said there's no way getting around this. My personal experiences with families and clients alike is that for some, it's a tough topic to broach, right? And some may even prefer to like not talk about it and hope that it goes away. Yes. You know, if we just ignore it, maybe I'm not going to have to deal with this in the future. Naturally, it's a tough topic for general society, and it is, I believe, exponentially more challenging when it comes to individuals with developmental disabilities, what's near and dear to my heart, autism, but even beyond, because there are added dimensions and layers to this: language barriers, language skill deficits. We also need to consider culture and customs of the family, and so many other things and beyond, social skills considerations too. And so it's a tricky area. So for some, it's like, let's just not talk about this, you know, and hope that it goes away. And then there are some that are saying, help me, right? It's for, you know, it can be taboo, it can be daunting and beyond, but start somewhere, right? Because it's going to be there. And to that note, your thoughts on the importance of this. Like, what happens if you try to just push it away, Jess? How does that work? If we just kind of, not great. Yeah,
not
exactly.
Great. I think, I mean, in some cases, you know, this is okay, right? And for all the reasons that you mentioned, this is hard for so many reasons. But a couple of things. We need to think about both things like puberty and changes to your body, which for some individuals who really, really like things to stay the same all the time, that in and of itself can be really challenging.
Yes.
Thinking about safety skills, you know, we know that individuals with autism are both exponentially more likely to be victims of, sexual assault or other sorts of sexuality related incidences than other disability populations, not just than sort of other neurotypical populations, but also they're also more likely to be offenders of sexual misconduct as well, for lots of reasons related to all kinds of things, the way that we teach, and some things related to sort of diagnosis as well. And so from a safety perspective, this is really, really important. It's important to sort of set up good foundational skills early and as often as possible. But also from a quality of life perspective, thinking about people that are adolescents and adults, and that we want to have autonomy, we want to have control over your own life, and we want you to have a great life. We can't ignore this part of that, right? That's part of being an adult. And for most of us, this is a really important part of our life, right? Relationships and sexual relationships. And so to ignore that entirely it's not fair, right? I think it means we're not really doing a good enough job for this community in the service that we're providing. So both sides, right? We're sort of setting people up to be potentially in vulnerable situations, which, no clinician that I've ever worked with wants to be doing that, right? And also that we're kind of ignoring a big piece of something that is really important for people.
Absolutely. So any parents who are watching, I really want to hammer home this point of two aspects to why it's important to figure this out, support your child through this period of time of change, as you mentioned, which can be hard no matter what it is for individuals on the spectrum, let alone changes that are happening to your body. Two things that are super duper important. One is that safety aspect. I don't think a lot of people know that, even in the general community, and that it's not anything intentional, let's just say, in terms of, you talked about offenses, right? Like the likelihood that someone may unintentionally be involved in some sort of offense. Examples may be things like not understanding the difference between private versus public, right? And exposing yourself to the community. Well, when you're a little one and you're 4 years old, society's maybe, it's not good to begin with because there's also vulnerabilities for yourself. Society may be more forgiving. As you grow older and you're bigger, it's hard for people to wrap their heads around this being a skill deficit. That's just one example of many,
of course.
Right?
It's hard, and it's things like, think about some of the inherent components to autism, right? Things like social communication challenges.
That's right.
Right? If you have a hard time following, nonverbal communication from people, then issues around consent become really hard. We like to talk about consent as this big, loud, enthusiastic, clear yes or no. But in reality, it's a lot of that, right? Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's subtle, moving away, turning away types of things. Think about things like perseverative behavior in ASD, right? And that, that's an easy step into stalking. And so there's just parts of an autism diagnosis in particular that make this extremely vulnerable. And it's stuff that we're not really teaching to very well. I mean, some people certainly are, but, not very well. And it's stuff that we really need to be considering. And this is hard, right? Sexuality, relationships, this is hard, complicated, complex things anyway for all of us. And so, that means that we need to spend even more time here, right? We need to think about learners that take, lots and lots of trials to learn easy discriminations. Yeah. Well, now think about, all of the components of dating, right? Or of a relationship, or, of safe sexual encounters, or all of these parts that are compounded by it being a little bit taboo and uncomfortable to talk about, and, parts of their own diagnosis that make it challenging to access that information. And so, we need to be teaching even more in this area than we are, for other things. And yet, for so many reasons, we're kind of shying away from it a little bit. And so it's complicated. It's all hard. It's all complicated. I talk to parents and say, how many people think that like their first relationship, they were just killing it. It was great. It was amazing. You had this all under control and you knew exactly. Like, nobody feels like that. Everybody feels like it's a disaster and it's so hard. And it is so hard. And so we really need to make sure that we're supporting this.
Absolutely. So can't overstate the importance of
really
addressing
can't.
this. And I know I'm probably going to say that many times throughout this episode because as we've already discussed, naturally, it's a complex, tricky issue to navigate. Even just for the general world, you know, when you've got kids of your own and teens, it can be tricky to help support your own kids through it. And, you know, my kids don't have any diagnoses, for example, but even more so for the autism population. So we don't want individuals with ASD to be vulnerable to any risks themselves. We want them to learn key component skills. We'll talk about some of that. We don't want them to be in difficult situations where they can get themselves into trouble. That's super important. And then the second thing that you said that I really love is it is a part of quality of life. Relationships are important. I mean, I myself have had experience with clients who've said to me like, you know, like, I want to learn about dating. Yes. And I'm like, okay, this is great. Let's have these conversations, right? And there are nuances to that too. And they should experience all of that for themselves as well. So we can't overlook that piece either.
And as parents, that's hard, right? Again, like I also have 2 teenagers. No parents that I know are like, you know what's so exciting? My kid is starting to date. Yeah. It's amazing. I'm so excited about this. Like, it's scary and it's terrifying and it's all sorts of other things, right? But it's also good, and it's more scary, you know, for people that know that their child has some social communication challenges, for example, and they're vulnerable, and everybody wants to protect their child, and everybody wants to, you know, keep them safe and keep them okay, and nobody wants to watch their kid get their heart broken. And I mean, this is hard.
Sure.
But it's part of becoming an adult. It's part of becoming your own person. And, you know, as much as we kind of don't want to do all of that part, we also don't want our kids to be lonely and to, you know, miss out on some of these really important parts of life too, right? So I think it's very normal for parents to be sort of, you know, upset and leery and kind of just want to think, well, maybe we don't need to do this yet. I think that's a very normal parenting perspective too.
It is.
But I think it's coming either way. So better that we're helping our kids be prepared.
It's a really important take-home point here, that it needs to be addressed irrespective. You can not address it, but it's still coming. We've had some tricky conversations with families about, okay, so this is important. Yep. They hear you, absolutely. There's an element to this too, which is cultural.
Of course.
Right? Where it's like, well, you know, and I can certainly appreciate this, and I want to be respectful of this, where families will say, well, you know, as part of our culture or upbringing or, you know, experiences, we don't talk about these things. Mm-hmm. So what advice do you have for families in those kind of situations, or even professionals, to be frank?
Yeah.
Because there are professionals out there who want to help their clients and the families alike, and broaching the conversation, even knowing the importance of it, sometimes can be a hard, tricky situation to navigate. So thoughts on that, your experiences with that, how do we move forward from there?
I mean, 2 different parts to that, I think, right? The first one was with families and respecting their own, you know, morals and values and culture. And as behavior analysts, we have to do that all the time anyway. Yes. It's just that with sexuality and sex education, there's so much of that, right? You know, it feels like it's such a concentrated area where everybody has their own values and everybody has their own morals, and some of those are individual, and some of those come from your family, and some of those come from your broader culture. And so do we as clinicians, right?
That's right.
And so I think just knowing that going in helps a little bit. Thinking a little bit about, you know, I talk to families very openly. I think even before we're having these conversations, making sure we're spending a lot of time building good rapport with families, recognizing that, you know, these might be comfortable conversations for us as clinicians. Yeah. They might not be for families. And so we have to be respectful of that. We have to put in the effort to make it more comfortable, to develop a good working relationship, to understand that we might have to have these conversations several times, which is another, you know, tuck that one away for another point for start early. Because it might take a while, right? For some families, this is a terrible thing to talk about. Yeah. It might be very uncomfortable. It might be things like, you know, families that are starting to sit down and say, you know, hey, my teenage child is masturbating in the family room and their sister is mortified.
Yes.
they may never have said the word masturbating in their whole life,
Yeah.
right? So this is hard. I talk to families a lot about, what are you concerned about? Like, what are the things that are driving this, and what are you worried about? We talk a lot about safety, and safety for their child, and that, I understand why these are things that maybe you don't feel comfortable talking about or teaching about, and are there other people in your family that can? Sometimes family members have, an older cousin is a great example, or someone else that is a little bit more comfortable talking about it. And so we sort of brainstorm ways around some of that stuff as well.
Yeah.
And being able to say, these are the realities, these are safety skills. And the concern is to keep your child safe. And so most parents will they want to do that, right? They want to work with that part. And then really discussing, what makes the most sense for them and what's the best way to do this for them, and then inching our way in, right? We're good with systematic behavior change and slow, careful steps. And so, talking about things that way as well. From a staff perspective, most people, are not out there in the world being like, what I really want to do?
Yeah.
I really want to do this. I really want to teach people about all these uncomfortable things about sexuality.
My calling in life.
It certainly wasn't my calling in life. And it's not like anybody that I know that works in this is. So some of that comes from just practice. And with my staff, we would talk a lot about, we would practice. We would practice having these conversations. We would practice saying these words. We would talk a little bit about, our own biases and our own perspectives, and what that feels like. And I think, the reality is most people that really, really want to do this can get to the point that they can do this comfortably.
Yes.
I think there's a small group of people that just, they can't. And it's our responsibility to make this a comfortable, clear, easy teaching situation for our clients. That's what has to come first.
Yes.
When we're not comfortable about a subject matter, we tend to dance around it a little bit and use some more innuendo and some more metaphors. And for people with communication challenges, that's the worst way that we can teach this stuff, right? Yeah. And so, the reality is we need to make sure that we are going to be able to teach this information in the right way for our clients. And so, we practice, we work with it a lot. We talk, we role play, we practice out scripts. I model a lot.
Yes.
And most people kind of get the hang of it, and they feel a little bit silly, and they kind of get there, and that's great. And if they can't, then, maybe this isn't the part of teaching for that individual, and that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. The excellent advice. I think the journey has to be appreciated from both perspectives, family's perspective and staff's perspective. And I myself find myself having conversations with, some of the staff that I work with, mentors, supervise, saying, it's probably not going to be a one-shot deal. It's not going to be this one conversation. You're going to address it, tips and tricks, and here you go, and here's some resources, and
wrap that up. All done.
Okay, that would be great. Honestly, if that were that simple, that would be fantastic. To appreciate that journey and the nuances and multiple conversations. And sometimes I've certainly had the experience where the conversation starts and it's, okay, why don't you digest that?
Yes.
Take it home, think about it. It's a process, right? We don't have to make all the decisions today. Yeah. Where can we start, even as a starting? Are you ready for a small, teachable target or skill that we can start with? And if you're not, that's okay too, right? It's likely going to involve, pretty sure it's going to involve multiple conversations, and it's a process for families and for staff too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to that end, we talk about this as a very serious thing, but I think reminding everyone to have a little bit of a sense of humor here.
Yes. Yeah.
And, it's going to be awkward sometimes.
Sure.
And things are going to happen that you're like, oh, that's not what I was expecting from, that's not what I was prepared for. And so I think, I'm a firm believer that we can set the tone for the interactions that we're going into. And so, if I can go into this with a level of I can talk about this comfortably. It's a little bit funny sometimes. Yep. It's okay. And also we're just going to talk about it this way, and it's easy and it's comfortable. I think that goes a long way for both staff and families.
Absolutely.
Right? Whereas, I've never gained a lot of ground by going into families' houses and, sitting on the edge of their couch and introducing myself as Dr. Cauchi and, speaking extremely formally about this. We have to, this is their home, this is their kid, this is a big deal, and it's okay. It's, if I want them to start to think of this as a good step for their kids, then we have to propose that. We have to make it sound like that too.
Yeah. Understand where we're going, why we're doing this, why it's important, framing it like that. And there's going to be steps along the way, and acknowledging like it's your kid. When we're involving parents, it's hard, like you said too, and I can certainly appreciate this as a parent myself. It's hard to wrap your head around sometimes that your kids are growing up and their changes are happening, and oh my goodness, like these are big steps, for any family. So hey, that's cool. Like, it's cool if it's a little awkward. It's cool if it's strange. It's cool to be in denial that your kid's growing up. Like, we've been there, as all parents have been.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges sometimes for parents is we're starting to talk about, puberty and changes that way. Mm-hmm. It's an undeniable sort of in your face moment of like, my kid is almost not a kid.
Yes.
And sometimes that evokes all these feelings of like, oh my goodness, and where are they going to live, and what's going to happen when I get older, and what are they going to do for a job? And like, it sometimes is sort of the catalyst for this big snowball, right? And so I think, again, remembering that piece as clinicians too, of like, okay, so maybe we need a little more time with this.
Yeah.
The other piece is, what we're expecting of families in these situations is a lot. A lot of our, when we think about sort of neurotypical development in sex ed, a lot of that comes from school. Mm-hmm. In whatever form that may or may not look like. But, for a lot of these kiddos on the spectrum, classroom style didactic learning is not where they're getting their best source of information. Mm-hmm. So they might be missing out on that piece. The next reality is, most kids get a lot of their education about sex from their friends.
Yeah.
And it's a very different type of education, right? I have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old. The way that they talk to their friends about sex is not the way that I talk about sex. That's their friends, and that's their peer group, and that's important. And so, for lots of other reasons, we know that kids with autism are often missing out on that information from peer groups. Mm-hmm. So if they're not getting sex ed from school and they're not really getting it from their friends, that shifts that burden onto parents a lot, right? And the reality is, for my kids, I might think that I am a great source of wise information and they should come to me with all of their questions, but they do not actually, turns out, want to talk to their mom about lots of things related to sex.
No,
it's one of those weird
dating,
things about
stuff.
teenagers, right?
Yeah.
And so that's fine.
Yeah.
But, if we don't have these other sources of information for some of our kids on the spectrum, then they are having to have these conversations with parents. And sometimes those are things that parents aren't really expecting to have those conversations with their kids either. Maybe they didn't have to talk to their other kids about, masturbating in the living room. And so they're not really ready for that, or sort of expecting that level of, direct teaching that might need to happen. And so I think, again, as clinicians, remembering that, we're expecting a lot of families in this area. We're expecting a lot of families in lots of areas.
Sure.
But this is one where families often kind of get to wash their hands of some of these parts of teaching where in this case they may not get to.
Yeah, they have to do a lot of the heavy lifting here.
It is awkward, right?
Yeah,
like some of
sure.
it is.
Absolutely.
And so, those are hard conversations to have with your child about some of these things. And so, acknowledging that is
acknowledging
important.
that. And I also really like that you said that staff role playing, practicing this, just getting comfortable talking about this. I've heard you say, and I've said this to my staff many times too, terminology is important, right? Getting comfortable with the vocabulary, using the appropriate terms. If the child's masturbating in public, that's what you're going to label it as, and we're going to work on that skill in terms of, teaching privacy and dignity and all those different pieces. But being able to practice with staff, get comfortable with teaching however that's going to look for that given client ahead of time can definitely be helpful. And it starts with conversation. So here we certainly grasp the importance of it, and families, it can take time, but are ready to come on board. So we're getting started now, right? Where do we start? You talked about consent being an important aspect to this, and I want to dive into that a little bit, because I think that this is Well, it's important for treatment in ABA no matter what.
Yeah.
And certainly as a field, I know we can appreciate this, and we talk about it in terms of even engaging in treatment, selection of teaching targets, and strategies and more, and all of that's really important. In this area in particular, I think it's incredibly important. It likely will involve also multiple conversations with multiple people. So what should we consider when it comes to consent? Family and clients alike, and assent too, because we can talk about that as well. What do we need to think about when we're getting into teaching important skills when it comes to sexuality?
There's so many pieces to that, right? And so, one of the things that we talked about earlier was this idea of starting early. And I think there's lots of stuff that we can teach, little kids that has nothing to do with sexuality, but it's going to lead to some of these things. Right? So when we think about consent is such a good example of that. We think about consent, we need two parts, right? We need, how do I give consent or remove my consent or not give consent to things that I do and don't want? And how do I honor indicators of consent, assent, and both of the removal in other people, right? And those are two sort of different skills and both important. And so, thinking about consent as things like, that's asking people before you do something and waiting for a response, and accepting delay and accepting denial, and accepting that sort of from verbal and nonverbal cues from somebody, right? Like if they ask, hey, can I have a drink of your water? And they say, no. Can you acknowledge those sorts of things?
Yeah.
And the other side is, being able to talk about the things that you like and the things that you don't like, and saying, yes, I like these things, and giving verbal and nonverbal indicators that you want something or don't want something. And being able to say no in ways that are, appropriate and heard. And so all of those things really actually have nothing to do with sex, right? And so we can start teaching those skills to 4-year-olds in EIBI settings. We can teach you to ask for things and wait. And we can teach you to say, no, I don't want to do this. Or I do want to do this, or can we do that thing again? We can teach you to respond to verbal and nonverbal indicators of consent from other people. We can teach you that your words matter. So if you say, no, don't touch me, we don't touch you. And so we can teach a lot of those things to little kids early and often, and build up those skills as they go. Sometimes what happens, and this is a tricky area, and this is a tricky area for ABA overall right now, is if I want people to be able to say no, they don't want something, and I want to be able to teach them that skill, they have to be in a situation where they don't want something, right? So, this becomes challenging to teach some of these things. If I want someone that can understand, no, we do a really good job in ABA of the tolerating delay part, right? Someone saying, can I go to McDonald's? I don't know, we can ask mom when she comes to pick you up. Or maybe you can go on Friday. Or I don't know, that sounds like something you could do on the weekend. Or maybe later. We don't do a good job of saying, no, we're not doing that.
It's not possible.
And there are things that are, no, you can never touch somebody that doesn't want you to touch them. That's just no. That's not, maybe later, maybe this afternoon, maybe, no. If that person said no, you can never, ever touch them. You can never, ever masturbate in a public park. Ever.
That's a no.
Not on Friday. Not on the weekend. Not when mom picks you up. Never.
Those are absolutes.
And so these are uncomfortable things to teach, right? And I don't want to teach you that because you're not going to like that answer and you're going to be upset by it. If I'm teaching you, to say, no, I don't want to do this thing. No, I don't want to do this puzzle right now is a good place to start. And the answer to, do you want to do this puzzle right now, Nancy, is no, thanks. Or no, can I do this instead?
That's right,
But if someone is trying to, convince my teenage daughter to go upstairs with them at a party and they don't want to go, that's not no thanks. That's not, oh, I want to do this instead. That's a really loud, emphatic, hard no. And so we have to teach that too. That doesn't always come naturally from, no thanks, I don't want to do this puzzle. And if we're going to teach people to say no, sometimes we have to say, okay, you don't have to do it.
That's right, you got to honor it.
And we don't really want to do that part either, right? We like people to do the things that we want them to do and that they're supposed to be doing. And so, a lot of these skills sound good and important, but when it comes to actually teaching them, it's hard. And so we have to really think about, is the way that we're teaching this skill going to lead to it showing up in real life? What are the maintaining contingencies here? What's the stimulus control? And am I practicing it enough, right? All of the things that we know as behavior analysts are important to maintaining any other skill. We need to make sure that we're applying those to these things that we're teaching too.
Absolutely. You said so many great things there.
A lot of things.
And anybody writing, if you're watching, write this down. These are all teaching targets. They are so important and systematic in the sense of planning. You got to think about these things ahead of time, whether you're a parent or a clinician. It's our duty to, in order to have this wonderful, fulfilled, prosperous future, right? I would say sometimes like I have a window into the future. I think about the future because I've been doing this for 25 years. I know you've been doing this a long time too, 20 plus and counting. We lose count after a while,
because
right?
after a while it makes me sound old.
Right.
So it's a fine line between like very experienced, but also
expert.
you must have been very young when you started
right.
doing
I
this.
was really young. I'm just an expert.
Yes.
That's, I like to frame it like that,
Yes.
right? Experience and is a wonderful thing in these situations. But yes, so but I think about that, right? I think about where are we going? Where are we going here? And so everything that you talked about that is so critically important to teach that 4-year-old will lead to a fulfilled, happy life as an adult and autonomous life too, because that's something that we need to really think about, right? And it's dynamic. So this is a really important thing for people to think about because it's not all or nothing. You can't say no to everything in life or else your child, then teen, then adult's going to do nothing. And we know what that looks like too. That's group home life in a room that is, not enriched with wonderful things. And it's not the kind of world that anybody wants to live in. So sometimes we got to do things that we don't feel like doing.
Of course.
That's part of life too. It's gray though. And you pointed out so well some of that gray where it's like sometimes it can be, nah, not right now or maybe later. And then there's the other side of that, which is absolutely no.
Yeah.
Absolutely no for me and absolutely no for you.
Yep.
And so it's a dynamic thing to consider. But this is why I love ABA, because we're so optimistic. It's very teachable.
Of course.
If we think about it systematically, and we think about all those nuances that you talked about. This is tricky because we don't think about these kind of things, right? Like we don't appreciate, I think, in the natural world, how all these things evolve and come to be, for any of us, right? But here we are, we have to, because we have a population that deserves the opportunities to learn these things. We as behavior analysts can do so if we think about it systematically. And I think that's what you're sharing is some of the systematic targets to consider here that ultimately lead down the road to this wonderful life with great relationships and enjoyable times.
Yeah, we get overwhelmed, right? We sort of sometimes look at these things and are like, sure, I'm going to teach about consent. And you're like, what is that though, really?
Right.
And it's kind of overwhelming and it's this big thing and we sort of go, yeah, maybe not. Maybe that's not in my competency. Maybe I can't do that. Maybe that's a lot. We're these like superhuman people, behavior analysts, and we can take these big complicated skills and break them down and figure out, okay, what is something that I can teach right now and what's the next little step and the next little step. And so if we start to think about, I think for a lot of these skills, it's what does this look like in real life?
Right.
Right? We think about it with things like menstrual care. Okay, so what does that mean? As, if I'm looking at this for a teenager at school, what does this mean? This means you have to, be able to manage menstrual care products. It means you have to be able to carry them with you. You have to identify when you're almost out of them. You have to identify the onset of your period, what you need when, what preferences you have, right?
Yes.
Every woman I've ever known cares deeply about what kind of menstrual care product they use, but we don't often teach that choice to individuals on the spectrum. We say, here's what you're going to use, off you go. And so, we think about all of those skills from the big picture of like, what does this really look like? Okay, so how do I break that down? How do I teach each of those as separate things? It's not one program for, menstrual care.
Yeah.
It's carry your stuff with you, identify this, do this part independently in the bathroom. It's all of these separate pieces. And we're good at this. We do this with, we teach kids how to cross the road safely and play board games. And this isn't that much more complicated than those other skills that we teach. We just have to think about them the same way.
Exactly. And plan, right? And engage the family. So we've talked a lot about, families' involvement in all this. And I think it's important even prior to the introduction of any of these teaching programs is to say, okay, here's what we think. Is this what it looks like in other environments too? What do you think about this? Or how would this work in this environment? Or is there something else that comes up that we need to put into this program? Or, like menstrual care, like how are they going to carry those products, right? Yeah. Like we're thinking of it like this. Does that make sense for you? How are they going to access it at home when they're at home? Everybody needs to be on board. And also the client when they're able to. Absolutely. As well, right? It all depends on the clients that we're serving in terms of where their skills are at. And how we engage them, but we should be thinking about that as well, right? The preferences, I love that. Preferences for products that are used, across all sorts of different skills that we need, and we can allow for those things. We just need to think about the opportunities to allow the individuals that we serve to make those choices.
I think the thinking about the opportunities part is huge, right? Because we know how to assess preference. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things we're really, really good at. We have all these different ways to assess preference in ABA, right? So it's making sure that we are thinking about those because, a couple of times you mentioned things like dignity and autonomy, and that's how we get to that, right? Is on whatever level that our individual client is able to, express preference, do things independently, have some choice and control over their life, then that's what gets us to people feeling a sense of dignity and having some control over their life. And we think about the little ways that us as adults get to do those sorts of things. Yeah, that's part of all of this, right? And so looking for those opportunities to say, how am I going to make sure that you get some choice over this, or you get to express your preference over this, or you get to say, no, I don't like that, or I don't want that, or I don't want to go there, or I don't want to do those things. I mean, adolescents do that all the time. They tell us, I don't want to all the time. Yeah. So, starting to think about how do we teach that and how do we honor that? Because otherwise we end up with, adults on the spectrum that are very, very compliant and just do everything. And that's, we've learned a lot in our field over the last few years about we can't do that.
Don't do that.
We have to really make an effort that we are making sure that we are avoiding that.
Right.
And some of that comes from things like, teaching people to be as independent in the bathroom as possible. One of the things that is sort of a pet peeve of mine is people will say, yes, we spent all this time working on toilet training when kids were little, and they can do all of this. And then, then I'll talk to people that have clients that are, 9, 10, 11-year-old girls and say, well, how ready are they for menstrual care? And they're like, oh, well, we haven't talked about that yet. So now that means, though, that for like a whole week out of the month, someone's going to have to be in the bathroom with them. Yeah. It would be great if we could just keep that independent train rolling and really think about how we're setting people up for that. From a safety perspective, from a dignity perspective, all of those sorts of pieces. And that does mean planning. That means thinking ahead, because the reality is these are complicated skills. And for some learners, it's going to take them a lot of practice. And we afford that to younger learners. We afford a lot of time to practice, with lots of other skills when kids are little. And so we have to make sure we're planning well enough that we're still giving older learners enough time to practice as well.
Absolutely. It goes back to the opportunities too. Thinking about opportunities for independence is a key area in all of this as well. I always say, like, get out of the bathroom, like that toileting, self-care, menstrual care, whatever showering, shaving, whatever it is not mastered if someone has to stand there with them. Like, you got to get out. Like, sometimes it's just, it happens over time, I think, even for families too, right? When you're so involved in supporting your child with self-care and you really want to be there to help them, or you just need to get out of the house in the morning, right? You got to get your kid to school. You got to get to work. We're there. We're getting the job done, right? But just like everything else we teach, it's not going to happen unless we give opportunities. What is the independence, right? If we're not systematically thinking about opportunities for independence and getting ourselves out, bathroom is an example. It's like you see the quintessential, like the child is like in there and they're like doing the entire routine, and then there's the adult just standing there. They're like literally standing in the bathroom and the child can do it all. It's like, what are you doing in there?
But
like,
that's a scary leap, that last leap, right?
Yes.
That last leap when we're thinking about independence, it's in all of the things, right? It's in, we can teach kids to take the bus by themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
But at some point, then they have to take the bus by themselves.
Yes.
Right? Or walk home from school. Or, all of those pieces, if we're thinking about the amount of teaching that goes into some of those things, and a bathroom routine is such a perfect example of that, where at some point, then I am now saying, okay, so you're just going to do that and I'm going to be over here and I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to do something else. Or I'm going to, watch your phone on Find My iPhone on the bus, but you're going to go on the bus by yourself. Yeah. And so we talk about that piece a lot too, right? And I think that's sort of another whole side of this. And it comes back to some of the sexuality piece too, of like risk, and that it's risky to be an adult, right? It's riskier to be an adult than it is to be a kid, because when you're a kid, someone is looking after all of those things for you. It's risky to be in relationships. It's risky to be in sexual relationships. It's, that's risky in all kinds of ways, in an emotional way, in a physical way, in a legal way sometimes. And so, really acknowledging that piece too, I think, when we're working with families, to say that at some point, we're jumping into that part, and that part is going to be scary, and that part is going to be hard. And here's all the skills we're going to teach to try to make that part easier. But yes, there is a risk that if you now leave your child to shower in the bathroom by themselves, they may not wash everything perfectly.
Yes.
I can't control that.
Yeah.
We're going to teach that as best as we can. We're going to do as best as we can about that. And then we're going to get out.
Yeah.
And that's scary. And I think we have to acknowledge that that's scary and talk about everything we're doing to make that a little bit easier. But
it's such a good point. You're absolutely right. There is risk involved. But then I say to families and even, staff, when we're contemplating all this, is, okay, so let's look at the alternative. So the alternative bears risk too. If we don't move ourselves away, and it absolutely acknowledging the toughness of all that, if we don't do that, the alternative risk is that the vulnerabilities, the safety, lack of quality of life and independence and dignity, right? So how do we move from, that safe zone to some risk? And the nice thing again about ABA is you can do it incrementally. We can do this incrementally so that we mitigate some of it doesn't mean, just like you said, we can't absolutely absolve ourselves and themselves of all the risk that's there. Sure, they might not, shower the best at first. But again, I think a lot of kids have been there, teens and whatnot, we've all been there. So you can mitigate the source of comfort, I think, for families and also for us as clinicians, because we want the kids and the teens and the adults to be successful too that we work with, is that we're not just like throwing them into the water deep end and asking them to swim, right? Like there's some incremental steps that can be taken here, and hopefully people can take comfort in that.
I think so. And I think, thinking a little bit about, we've often sort of thought about and talked about independence as like a binary thing. You're independent or you're not independent.
Yes.
And I think we need to start thinking a little bit more about independence as sort of a spectrum of independence. Maybe I do have somebody that never really can wash themselves perfectly. So maybe that means that once a week, a parent is in the bathroom with them.
Yes.
And during the week, they shower themselves on their own. And if it's good enough, that's okay. I think as a field, we need to embrace this idea of good enough a little bit more than sort of perfect. Because sometimes that's okay, right?
Yes.
We think about, a perfect standard of menstrual care is managing all your products and changing them properly. And, but if you can't do that, then there's lots of great alternatives now. There's, lots of great, period underwear and things like that is a beautiful independent alternative that still keeps somebody out of the bathroom with you.
Yeah.
That might not be the same sort of standard, but is prioritizing independence. And so I think when we start to prioritize independence, it means we think about it a little bit differently and think about, most of the time, if this individual can be independent with this task, how do I make it safe? But maybe it's a different perspective of thinking about safe, right? Maybe it's watching your Find My iPhone while you're on the bus instead of being on the bus with you.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe it's an adult at the starting point and the ending point, but not traveling the whole way.
Yeah.
It's thinking about, how do we fade ourselves out of that? And again, we're good at this in ABA, right? We know about systematic fading. We know how to sort of move away from that a little bit. Sometimes that's harder for us to remember when we're out in the real world as opposed to, in our clinic or in our home settings. And it is harder. But I think that's some of what we can think about as well as, we do know about this. We know how to do this and remind ourselves that we know how to do that. And that will help us start to think of it in those ways.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm thinking too about all the common myths of ABA and how people might think of ABA in a more, I guess, structured sense, and it's teacher led, and we're going to just do very discrete things, and it's right or wrong. And those are absolutely all not true. Sometimes it does have its place to have a correct and incorrect response or whatever, depending on the skills that you're teaching, but it's so much more than that. And in fact, ABA, when you think about it dynamically and all the things that you're talking about today, is that it can lead to so much richness in terms of skill development, independence, autonomy, quality of life, that people don't always think of. But in fact, we have the tools, obviously, to do so. And for parents out there who may be watching, a starting point is to start having those conversations. Sometimes parents don't even know that they can ask for help. I just thought you guys we were doing letters and colors or whatever. Okay, toilet training. Many people have accepted we can do toilet training, but that's probably where it starts, right? Dressing, putting on your clothes. Okay, great. We can do so much more than that. We just need to start with the conversation, right? Yeah. Let's have the conversation, likely multiple conversations, get on board. So now you have clients and family alike that say, okay, Jess, okay, Nancy, I want it. I really do need help here. Where do we start? Where do you tell families in terms of conceptualizing? Because we talked about so many, it's complex, this whole, transition to teens and then adulthood in terms of sexuality, relationships. There's so much to this, right? How do we get going, Jess? Okay, so we've got this buy-in early. I love early. Let's start early. But even along the stages in life, how do people decide on those meaningful skills? How do we prioritize? What do we do?
It's really hard. And as a field, we don't have a lot of great resources to say, when we're looking at early learning skills, right? We have lots of great curricula that say you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and wonderful, we've done this. And part of that comes from, adult life is so individual, and we care about different things, and we like different things, and we want different things as adults, right? And so I think if you're picking something, I'm often thinking about what is going to give the greatest autonomy to that person. And so in a little kid, that's starting to teach you, how do you pick out your own clothes? Yeah. That's autonomy for a little kid, right? That's, okay, you only get to watch one show tonight, so which show should it be? And how do I help you figure out what your best preference is going to be here? Or, and so really starting to think about how are we giving choices and opportunities to make choices in our own life. And that's a skill. We often seem to think about choice making as just something that people can do. Making choices is a skill, and especially when we start to think about making choices that have bigger, broader implications, right? Some of this delay and denial and delay discounting stuff of I can choose this thing now, or I can save for something bigger and better later. Those are hard skills, right? Sure. But some of those are really underlying a lot of friendship skills and social interaction skills and workplace skills, right? Thinking about post-secondary education, that's really a delay discounting model. That's a work hard now, get payoff later. Okay, well, we'll go and see the movie or have the snack that my friend wants this time, and next time we'll see the movie that I want because I like to go places with my friend, and that means that sometimes we have to do things that they want too. And so all of those sorts of underlying skills that lead to greater autonomy and sort of greater control over our life, I think is what we prioritize. And as we think about that from all different aspects of life, I think that's a good gauge forward, is to think about, okay, so what will autonomy look like in friendships, and what can autonomy look like in our own self-care, and what can autonomy look like in our community engagement. And I think that's sort of where I've landed as if you don't have a great roadmap, that's sort of what I kind of keep coming back to for clients. Asking clients. You said already that you've worked with adult or adolescent clients that are like, I just really want to be dating.
Yeah.
Often I work with teens on the autism spectrum, and I'll say, look, your parents really want you to work on these skills.
Yeah.
Is there something that you want? And they'll almost always say either, I want to be able to go more places on my own.
Right.
Like I want my parents to let me go places and trust me. Or I just want to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And they don't want to tell their parents that, because who wants to tell their parents that?
Sure.
Right? And so I think, talking about what's important to individuals and what's going to matter the most to them, and not putting our own ideas of that on, is also really important.
Yeah.
And just thinking ahead. What, it's much more complicated to teach somebody to go to McDonald's and order their own food and wait in line and correct the order if it's wrong and pay and find an empty table. That's all way more complex than, touch your nose, what color is this, types of stuff that we're teaching.
Sure.
And it's not that stuff isn't important, it is. And we have great evidence to say why that's important. But remembering that, touch your nose is a simple discrimination. Go to McDonald's by yourself with a group of other kids is like 18 different skills in there.
Yeah.
And so we have to start working on those things before we're ready.
Absolutely. And one of the areas that you mentioned, and we've talked about throughout this conversation, is the relationships piece, right? So as our clients become teenagers, and even moving into adulthood, obviously, throughout life, social relationships are important. They become more dynamic and complex, and I guess relatively more autonomous, right? In terms of autonomy from, your parents and teachers and whatnot as you get older. So from the framework of relationships for, the families and clients that we serve, what are some important things that you think we should be thinking about in terms of skill building? Some key areas, okay, we've got like conversation skill, those kind of things. But the dynamics when it comes to going out with your friends, or I like this girl, and, we've had clients say, oh, there's this girl in my class, So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to relationships, whether it's with somebody they like or just hanging out with teens, that we should be thinking about for our populations that we serve?
I think one of the hardest balances in both of those situations is sort of this balance of, how do I make sure as an individual that I am doing the things that the other person likes to do enough of the time?
Yeah.
Right? Whether that's hanging out with my friends or, somebody that I'm interested in all ways, right? Whether that's picking where we're going out for dinner, or, what kind of public displays of affection that person is interested in, or, all parts of this. It's, how do I make sure that I'm doing enough of what my partner, my friend is interested in, that what they like, but also that we're also doing enough of what I like and what's important to me, right? Sometimes, and historically, we have not done a great job of this in our field, of teaching individuals on the spectrum to sort of stand up for the things that they want to. We've done a better job of teaching you to do things that other people want, which, isn't good. We have to fix that part.
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's a hard balance of, I like to do these things, I want to do this.
Yeah.
But you can't do the things that you want to do all the time that your partner or your friends don't want to do, because that's not really fair, and that's not really a sort of copacetic relationship. And nobody wants to be friends with somebody that only does it their way all the time. And so I think that underlies a lot of what we have to think about from both sides of that, right? Is, how do I stand up for myself? Yeah. And also, how do I care enough about what other people are doing? And sometimes that means going out of my own way, whether that's a friendship thing or whether that's sort of more of a relationship or something I'm interested in, sort of thing. And that underlies things like consent. That underlies, a lot of those sorts of pieces as well, I think, of, even if I think that girl in my class has the most beautiful hair in the whole world and I just want to touch it all the time. Yeah. I can't though, right? And so, teaching some of that inhibited responding and stuff as well is important.
Absolutely. And the notion, like, it's nice I sometimes call it your tribe. You want to find your tribe of people, whether it's romantically or friendship, or, maybe it starts as friendship, it turns into romance, who knows, that you share common interests. That's often how you find your tribe. And, as my daughter said, you vibe out or whatever. I don't know if she says it anymore, but,
Probably not.
I probably not. That was like 2 months ago. I'm
Probably
so,
not.
but, that you can have this mutual interests in, right? Like, that's nice, right? But it's not always going to be like that. And it's, you're not always going to like hit on the same activity or movie that you want to see, or, there's give and take. So sometimes you might, sometimes there needs to be give and take, and how do you navigate the give and take is tricky. And sometimes, as you've already mentioned, it's not so clear. It can be very subtle too, right?
And that's easier with friends, right? Because I think about even like as an adult, I have friends that like, this is my friend that I do this with because we both like that activity, right? And this is my friend that we do this with because we like that activity, but not this friend because they don't like that. It's easier to do that in a bigger group, right? But when you start to sort of look at a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a partner, that's a little bit harder because now you want to do all these things with this one person, but maybe they don't like horror movies, or maybe they don't like Thai food, right? And so in friendship groups, I think it's a little bit easier to sort of find the like, these are the people that this thing happens with, and these are the people that this thing happens with. The other part that I just sort of thought a little bit about while you were talking was relationships change. And, think about like high school relationships, and now this is your friend and now you're into them but they're not into you, or they're into you but you're not really into them, or they were your friend and now you're dating and now you're not dating. Are you still friends? What are the rules now? What do we do now, right? It's just so hard anyway. But again, when we think about a population that tends to be much more comfortable with rules and structure and parameters, that's really hard. And so making sure that when we're teaching, when we're thinking about those things, we're teaching about some of that stuff too, and that it's not just you're a friend, you fit this mold, and you're a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you fit this. It's some of that is transient, and you're not that person all the time. And when you're little, the relationships that you have with other people fit solidly into one of those places, right? You have family, and you have teachers, and you have friends, and they all can fit into those little pockets or bubbles pretty nicely. But then think about, even things like, well, now you have friends that you work with. Right? They're not really your true self friends a lot of the time, because you still have to sort of behave a different way at work. But maybe you like those people, but you're still following sort of different rules for work friends than you are for like friends. And the same for, people that you are interested, but they're not interested in you. Or, these sort of dynamic relationships in adolescence and adulthood are much harder because they're not static, because they move, because they change, because they're not exactly the same mold for everybody. And so that's another area that we have to make sure that we're thinking about teaching in, and sort of how do you respond to those things, and how do you backpedal a little bit if you've misjudged.
Right. Yeah. And that's okay too. That's going to happen, right? It's experience. A lot of this is experiential, but what we hope for a lot of the individuals that we work with is that we can help mentor the experience and guide the experience, at least support, right? Not just be out there, and because that can really be tough. For any teen or adult, never mind if you've got autism, let alone, right?
For sure.
As we were thinking about that and some of those complexities, I was thinking about a question that I often get from families and some of the clients too that we work with, which is, not only do we have the face-to-face world or even the phone world, we also have the social media world, right? This is a tricky area for some of the clients that we work with to navigate. And families, rightly so, have also expressed concern to me for their kids' success in this area. So some may say, I just don't want them on it. Like, I'm just going to outright ban, just like any parent, okay? We have the same conversations as we would have with any parent of any adolescent, or even before. We're seeing this in like our tweens, right? Like early on, these conversations start. Others, they want to police it. They want to be in there and see everything their kid is doing. and everything in between. Okay, so it's scary. What are some things for us to keep in mind in terms of setting individuals with autism up for success when it comes to this social media online world? What should we be thinking about when it comes to that? It's a little unique in a sense. I mean, there's some parallels, but there's some uniqueness to this world.
It is. I mean, again, I think there's like 800 things that we need to think about.
Sure, yeah.
It is scary.
Yeah.
And there are, you know, it may not happen proportionately that often, but there are real ways that people can get in trouble. Again, from both sides, right? People can end up as victims in online interactions, and they can end up, you know, as perpetrators in online interactions. And so one of the things that I think we have to do a better job of, the same as sort of we talked about with some other things, is being really clear and really direct.
Yeah.
You know, I've worked with people that are in their early 20s, right? That are sort of saying, oh, well, now I'm chatting to this person and I'm chatting to this person and we're getting along really well and blah, blah, blah. And then I asked them, or they sent me some pictures of themselves. Then I found out that they're 16. That's going to get you in trouble, like legal trouble.
That's right. Yeah.
And for many people, they're like, I didn't know. I don't know. I didn't know that that's against the law. And so I think being really clear in our teaching about things like legal implications for actions online, and that things like, you know, accessing pornography and who you share personal information with and who you don't share personal information with, and what you elicit and what you don't. I think is something that we kind of shy away from because we don't really want to talk about things like our kids watching pornography. But that's so accessible and so easy and such a landmine of places that people can get in trouble really easily. So I think we need to deal with things head on right away.
Yeah.
While I completely understand I'm just not going to let them have this ever, or I'm going to don't worry, I have all the parent blocks in place, or all the reality is, again, our kids are better at this than we are.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
There's nothing you can do about that. And it's so accessible. So if it's not happening at home, it's going to happen somewhere else. And so the reality is, I think we can't pretend that we can just control access or monitor access, because it's, you know, our kids are pretty savvy, and they're going to figure out how to do this in a workaround way anyway. And so I think just really thinking about the unique dangers to being online, legal dangers, financial things, right? As kids get older, you're thinking about, you know, my kids, when they were really little, they like bought things on apps without realizing that cost real money, right? And so, you know, thinking about some of that perspective as well. And that there's lots of other rules, right? There's rules about who you share information with and who you post pictures of, and that you can't post pictures of your friends online without their permission.
Right.
And you can't, you know, FaceTime people while you're sitting on the toilet. And, you know, all of those sorts of little nuanced things that are sort of unique to online interactions are things that we have to think about and teach to.
Very explicitly.
Yeah. But again, I think about, you know, if I have a 23-year-old that wants to start using a dating app, what are the components of that? Well, that's finding the appropriate app and setting your own username and password and tying financial information to that without, you know, getting screwed over. And who do you share personal information with and not? And how do you communicate with people online? Because there's all kinds of abbreviations and emojis and other language requirements of online communication that we need to make sure we understand what that means. And then there's, you know, how do you flirt with somebody online, and how do you get into or out of interactions that you do or don't want to be in, and how do you safely arrange to meet up with people? But again, so much of that has nothing to do with it being a dating app, and everything to do with it just being online interactions. And a lot of that I can teach a 10-year-old is playing Roblox or Minecraft.
That's true.
With their friends about how do we do this online? You know, who do we share information with? And we practice, right? We, you know, create Snapchat accounts that you can practice with people with when kids are little. So they're learning some of those fundamental skills as you have less and less control over their environment as they get older. And I think that's sort of the key, is that inevitably, whether we like it or not, we have less and less control over our environment as people become older kids and teens and adults. And that just makes teaching harder. And so if we can teach some of these hard things when we have perfect control over the environment, right? If I can give my 8-year-old Snapchat, but the only people that they're friends with is their cousins or, you know, my friend's kid or someone like that, you can practice and you can learn before I have no control over that. It's just that we're scared of doing that, right? I don't want to give my 8-year-old Snapchat. I don't want to, you know, let my 10-year-old have his own YouTube channel or, you know, talk to people on Roblox because maybe they'll have, you know, maybe they'll be talking with people there. Maybe.
Yeah.
But it's still a better way to practice some of those underlying skills, I think, while we still have, you know, a bit more control over the environment. Yeah. And that leads to 23-year-olds that, yes, now I have to teach you the really challenging parts of flirting with somebody online and, you know, how do you know whether it's safe to meet them or not and what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
But I don't have to teach you, here's how you set a username and password. And, you know, here's what BRB means.
Right.
And also they don't want to see a picture of you sitting on the toilet. And also you can't take a screenshot of that conversation and post it on your Facebook. That's not okay.
Yeah.
And so if I don't have to teach you all of those things, I can really focus on that challenging part that's related to some of those sexuality skills per se, because I've already taught you all of these fundamental skills. And so I think about a lot of online safety that way.
That's great. Really, really,
it's a
really
long-winded
good.
answer.
No,
for what you
it's
asked.
excellent. There are nuances that need to be considered. And as you were talking, I was thinking, it's kind of like bittersweet. It's kind of a part of parenting and the experience of your hopes and dreams are that your kids grow up and they become independent, they become their own self, and they even like exceed you in your skills, right? Like they do better than you. That's what we all want, right? And at times, from what I've heard from families, you know, the experience when you hear a diagnosis is like, maybe that's not going to happen, and how that's going to happen may look differently, right? And so now you've got your kid who is indicating interest in wanting to navigate the social world, and the social world is in person and online now. That's how it goes. That's the world we live in. And so, and they're pushing, they're seeking independence. They want to, like, you know, get out of my way. I want to push the boundaries a little bit, like any kid would in development, right? When that happens and how that happens and how it manifests itself, it may look different for individuals on the spectrum, but it's something that you almost thought wouldn't be possible for some families, at least that I've chatted with at that diagnosis stage. And now it's happening. And so it's kind of bittersweet because you want them to be on that road to independence, but it's a little scary, as we've talked about. And so you don't have to put the guardrails completely up, right? Like we can take it one step at a time.
I mean, I think that's true for a lot of things with parenting, right? Yeah. Like I think about the life that I want my kids to have, but it would be great if we could just like jump to there.
Sure.
And skip the like learning part and the heartbreak part and the failures and right? Like all of that hard part that we know is inevitably on the road to getting to that, you know, that great life for people. Everybody wants to sort of shelter their kids from that piece, right? And I can only imagine that for parents of kids on the spectrum, that feeling must be so much more exponential, that they're just so worried that here's all the ways that can happen poorly for my kid, but also they are going to fail. I mean, the reality is they are going to do things that are wrong.
Yeah.
They're going to do things that get themselves hurt, that hurt other people. I mean, that's a part of learning this path to being autonomous and a good quality of life and being an adult, right? And so I think we need to do what we can to minimize the risk of that in terms of not exposing you to risk. You have to be exposed to risk. That's how you learn. Yeah. We learn from making mistakes. We have to make mistakes to learn. But that we're teaching problem solving and asking for help and, you know, all of these, how to stay out of legal trouble and these things that have big, big, big implications, so that you have a little more room to do some of that. One of my biggest mentors is Dr. Peter Gerhardt, and one of the things he talks about is, you know, some of the best times in my life is when I was behaving inappropriately.
Right.
It's like, right? When I was out too late or, you know, drank too much or hanging out with my friends or like, those are the things that you talk about. Those are the things that you remember as an adult of thinking back in your life and being like, yeah, wasn't it great when we did this or when we did that? And they don't have to be harmful to people. Yeah. And they don't have to be wildly unsafe, but you know, a little bit inappropriate is sometimes what leads to good quality of life.
Sure.
And so we have to, I think about that as our goal sometimes too, of like, what skills do you need in those moments? So if it goes badly,
yes,
you can manage that and navigate that and prevent it from being bad.
Yeah.
But it's okay if it's a little bit bad. It's
Yeah.
okay if it's a little bit, you know, a little bit not perfect in line all the time.
Yeah, it's part of growing up and figuring out who you are as a person, right?
What you like and what you don't, and what makes you happy, and you know, that's, you have to experience things. You have to experience.
Yes,
you have to.
And it's very achievable, and it's achievable for individuals on the spectrum too. And it's our duty actually to allow for some of that to happen, right? We want to set people up for success. Everyone we want to set up for success. But like you said, there is a necessity. It's a part of learning. I mean, I go back to like a lot of the things that we do often, like toilet training. Like I want every kid to be toilet trained yesterday and to skip over things. But you know what? Accidents are part of toilet training. They're going to if you want your child to be out of diapers, they are going to have accidents. And it's just part of it. And if they're not, that means they're holding. That's a whole other situation. There's other issues with that. So it is normalizing to some degree some of these little mini trips. They're not complete, you know, falls and down the hill. There's going to be slip ups here and there. And in fact, there's so much richness to some of those slip ups, right? That's part of the growth that individuals on the spectrum deserve to experience, just like all of us.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think one of the challenges when I started thinking about teaching in sex ed, which was never, again, my biggest thing, is sometimes in terms of sexuality, those trips are a big deal.
Yeah.
Right? You can have accidents when you're toilet training. You can, you know, learn to play a board game with a peer and actually never let them take their turn the whole time.
Yes.
And you'll get to try that again.
Yeah.
Right? You touch somebody that doesn't want to be touched one time.
Yes, that's very true.
And you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You get caught masturbating in public one time and you're in trouble. And so I think, you know, it is scary. And I think we have to think about that piece, and that, you know, what are acceptable risk and what are really hard things that we have to make sure that we're teaching to. And sometimes those are the things that we're uncomfortable with.
Yes. Absolutely.
Right? And so we have to lean into those head on so that people can have more freedom and more autonomy and, you know, get to make some other types of mistakes as long as we feel comfortable. But these are not the ones that you're going to make, though.
That's right. Mitigating the risks.
Yeah.
We really have to think about mitigating the risks.
Yeah,
absolutely.
for sure.
And, you know, what are the stakes involved? So important. And to that note, I wanted to chat with you about, you know, something that's very near and dear to my heart, populations that are near and dear to my heart, which is individuals who are more profoundly impacted by autism. So for them too, and the individuals that we work with, the future, you know, they deserve a bright future as well. And we're working towards independence for them in many different ways: social relationships, independence when it comes to navigating puberty and beyond. Special considerations, though, need to be made. You know, we talk about like cognitive abilities. So if your cognitive abilities are impaired and you have difficulty understanding and expressing language, these kind of situations are going to be challenging in a different way to navigate. And how we support and teach through some of this, including puberty and beyond and relationships, it necessarily has to look different. Any considerations that come to mind for you? And again, I know this is like, there's a textbook on this somewhere,
Absolutely.
I'm sure. But
there's probably not. But
there's probably not. There should be. That's what I was about to say. I'm like, yeah, actually, there needs to, just like we said, there needs to be more resources developed in this area. But in the meantime, again, as we've talked about, it's not like when it comes to puberty and navigating things like, you know, masturbation, menstruation, and beyond, it's not that we can't support individuals who are more profoundly impacted. It's how we do so. So what are your thoughts in that area?
I think, again, this is, if the area of teaching about sexuality is under-researched, this is, you know, exponentially so.
So much so, yeah.
But, again, this isn't something happens to us as behavior analysts where we know how to teach and we know how to teach important things. And then we start throwing, but this is a sexuality goal in there. And we're like, I have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
You do know what to do though, right? And so I think, remembering that helps a lot. So thinking about, how does this person learn best? Do they learn best with visual supports? Do they learn best with a video model? Do they learn best with a sorting task? I've had kiddos that we've taught, how to decide whether a pad needs to be changed by sorting, pads that we colored on into piles.
Excellent.
And so think about, what do you know about this learner? What works well to teach them already? What am I going to teach about that? The other part I think we have to really think about is, what's the skill that I need you to have here? And so sometimes, and the same, I think this is almost harder when we talk about, learners that have more vocal language, because we kind of get caught up in that. We know, well established in ABA, that the things that we say we're going to do aren't always the things that we actually are going to do. Just because we can talk about what we should do or sort of share knowledge doesn't necessarily mean we use those skills when we need them. I give the example to parents a lot of the amount of times that I set my alarm in the morning to get up and go for a run versus the amount of times that I actually get up and go for a run, not the same thing. And it's not because I don't know I should. I'm not motivated. I don't understand the importance. I know all of those things. It's all these other competing contingencies. And so we need to think about that piece too, right? So sometimes when we think about, teaching and sexuality, we think about all the things that you need to know. You need to understand what is happening to your body to be able to engage in good menstrual care.
Right.
Actually, you don't, right? What you need to be able to do is manage these skills, right? It doesn't really matter if you can tell me that, the reason this is happening to your body is because there's an egg traveling down a fallopian tube. It doesn't really matter. What I need you to be able to do is, change your pad when you go into the bathroom independently and throw it in the garbage and not down the toilet.
Right.
That's it.
Sure.
That's what I need you to be able to do.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand all of what's happening behind it. It's great if you can.
Sure.
But you don't have to.
Yeah.
And so again, we know that in all kinds of other parts of ABA, right? We teach kids to stop at the edge of the road and look for cars without, never have I taught a kid, because you know what might happen?
Yeah.
A car might come flying down here and they could hit you and you could be like, I don't teach you that.
Yeah, just do it.
I just teach you how to do it.
That's right, yeah.
And so we can do the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so focusing on what's going to be most immediately and long-term relevant for that learner and how to teach that in the way that is best for them. That means that as a clinician, you might have 8 different programs saved on how to teach changing a pad. That's great. You're going to do that for whatever your learner needs. That individualization piece is so important. But, thinking again about what does this skill need to look like? If you're, more profoundly impacted learner is masturbating in the living room.
Yeah. Okay.
So how am I, I'm going to teach you, this is called private time. We do private time in our bedroom. Let's go up to our bedroom.
Yeah.
And I'm going to teach you the same way that I taught you pee in the toilet and not on the floor.
Right. Exactly.
Or, you get changed in your bedroom and you don't walk around naked in the rest of the house. Or you eat sitting at the table and not walking around the kitchen. We know how to do this. It's just we get kind of spooked by the sexuality part, right? But we have good tools to teach learners that are more profoundly impacted when we think about the behavioral demonstration of what we're looking for.
Excellent.
And so not getting too hung up on that.
Yeah. I love one of the, just to be nerding out for a moment, one of my most favorite ideas in science and concept principles is the notion of parsimony, that the simplest answer can often be the answer, and we should be seeking for that, very parsimonious approach. And a lot of the individuals that we work with, certainly at my clinic, not only, but many, who have more skill deficits when it comes to language or cognition, looking for some of those tips that you mentioned. I love that, you have answers for them. You have a simpler answer here. What's worked for them in the past, right? We've been able to teach many of our clients all sorts of skills. So look towards those. What strategies can be used to support learning? It doesn't matter that it has to do with sexuality or, you know, early academics or whatever, or, you know, expressive communication or whatever. You know, it's that you're looking for strategies that work.
Yep.
That's one thing. The other thing, major take home for me, is that what you spoke about earlier, which is early, start early. You can never start too early with some of this stuff, right? Even just as we, you know, as you were discussing, many of the examples have to do with just what is private, right? What do you need to do on your own versus public, right? Get ready. Menstrual care, you know, your daughter's getting a little older, 8, 9 years older, whatever, you know, these days, I don't even know when menstruation starts anymore. So it's okay to get used to some of this ahead of time, right? The products, the notion of dirty and clean, you know, there's a lot of opportunities. Start early.
Yeah. I mean, think about the challenges, again, unique to individuals on the spectrum, right? I mean, I've started looking at, you know, I've talked to places or talked to parents who are like, menstrual care, like, it's hard to get my kid to wear underwear.
Right.
They hate how this feels. Yeah, so we need to start that now because this is going to be a long desensitization process, right? Things like public and private. If I can teach you, you get changed in private, you pick your nose in private, you scratch your bum in private, it's going to be much easier for me to teach you, you know, you masturbate in private, because that's got a really big inherently built-in reinforcer to it.
Right.
And so if I don't have to teach you, hey, here's all these other things, that's going to be much easier.
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of these skills just get so much more complicated and so much harder when we put that sexuality piece into them. Yeah. But it's only a part of that more complex skill, and lots of that other stuff we can teach really young. So let's teach some of those things foundationally really well. And that doesn't mean, you know, we don't teach colors and we don't teach worksheets and we don't teach some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, I think this would be a great research study, but, you know, if you had to really ask parents, okay, what's more important? Can my 15-year-old do this math worksheet, or can they shower themselves independently? I think most people pick shower themselves independently.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right? Or, you know, do they not touch the person with the pretty hair who they touched them once and they said, please don't touch me? Yeah. Do they not keep doing that? Because most people pick that, I think.
Yeah.
But that's not really in line with how we necessarily set goals.
Absolutely. And the other thing we have to keep in mind, what we know about many of our clients, or maybe prospective clients, is learning trials matter. The number of learning trials, right? Yeah. It takes time. And what we mean by time is the opportunities, number of opportunities, right? And how many opportunities is very idiosyncratic. It depends on each individual, but we know it has to be there, right? And for some of the clients that we work with, there may need to be a lot more, hundreds, thousands, who knows? So you got to start, and you got to start now. That's what I say. Do it now, you know, because okay, what's the worst that can happen? They master the skill early. Okay, that's a good problem to have. Right? Like, we can just maintain it then. The alternative is, as kids get older, exponentially, it becomes more complicated. So then you're just having to deal with more stuff that's going to take longer to learn. It's going to be really unpleasant for the child, now teen, adult, and the family as a whole. Yeah. So better to start early, and opportunities to learn.
And, you know, one of the other things we know about how people learn is one of the things that impacts that is the value of that reinforcer that's acting upon that behavior, right? So again, when we take that out of our sort of structured teaching and into real life, yes, I might know that I'm not supposed to touch people that don't want me to touch them. Yeah. But if I do it, and it turns out that girl with the beautiful hair, it feels so nice to touch their hair. Yeah. That was a really powerful reinforcer, right? You know, yes, I'm not supposed to, you know, touch my penis when I'm sitting at the park, but I do, and it feels great. Yeah. That's really hard to compete with now. And so the reality is behavior is behavior. These principles act upon behavior whether we want them to or plan for them to or not. And so if I'm going to try to teach you, you don't touch that person's beautiful hair if they don't want you to touch them, that's that's going to be way easier, first of all, if you've never touched the beautiful hair,
right.
and you know that isn't that way. But also, I'm going to have to teach that. I'm not going to be able to just tell you that. I'm going to have to teach it. It's going to have some pretty powerful reinforcement tied to it, and lots of practice. So that means instead of, you know, our default is, okay, well, we're just going to move you to the other side of the classroom so you're not near the person that you keep touching. I need those opportunities, like you were saying, right? We need to practice being beside that person and not touching them, and having that not touching them access a lot of reinforcement.
Yes.
And so, again, take what we know about behavior and learning and apply that into those real life settings is more than just, well, we'll just remove you, or we'll just put some space here, or we'll just tell you. You can't, it makes her really uncomfortable, Nancy, when you touch her beautiful hair. You can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like all these rules of behavior that we know about, we sort of abandon or forget about or have nothing to do with once they start, you know, creeping into this area.
Yeah. And I want to highlight for people that are listening and watching, what you described in terms of, okay, just like people will say, just move them away. What's the big deal? The thing that people have to remember, we all need to remember, is that you cannot avoid these situations forever. Like you can move them.
Yes.
But ding ding, recess time, or you know, or we're in the hallway or whatever. There will be other opportunities where this can come up, and we don't want those unfortunate circumstances to occur. So, I mean, that's really what this is about today, right? It's about keeping kids safe from risk to themselves and risk to others, and really what we talked about at the beginning, and quality of life. That's the key here, right? In spite of the fact that this is all really tough and complicated and all the other things we talked about, and you've talked about too that this isn't what you set out to do.
No. Not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit. Certainly me as a clinician, you know, early in my career, it wasn't something that I was thinking about, to be frank. You know, we were thinking about really important things too, you know, how to get kids to ask for things,
of course.
How to get kids to attend to relevant things that they need to pay attention to, you know, play with their peers or whatever, you know, some key fundamental skills. But inevitably this kept coming up, right? It kept coming up. Parents, okay, it's coming, you know, what happens after toilet training or whatever, hop, skip, and a jump away from all this. For you, why do you do this? So you fell into it. You not only do it, you do it masterfully well, Jess. Like, you're amazing at this in this area. You teach us all. I learn so much from you every time I talk to you. You've done research in this area. You've committed a large portion of your life to this. So why? It wasn't something you intended to do. Why do it?
I mean, I think as behavior analysts, we need to remember, one of my favorite Pat Fryman quotes, and this is a giant paraphrase, is something to the effect of, you know, all behavior analysts went into this field to make the world a better place. And I believe that. I have never met a behavior analyst that doesn't, you know, really want this to be better for the people that they serve. And so I think there's lots of ways that we can do that. It's just that I think misstepping in things that are related to sexuality there's so many opportunities for that. I could work with, you know, adolescents on great job readiness skills, and they could be killing it at their workplace. But if they keep touching that person with the beautiful hair, they're fired, right? If you stand really, really, really close to people in the grocery store, eventually people avoid you. If you do it over and over again, eventually the manager says, you can't come back here. And so this piece, I think, is just so inherently woven into so many other things that if we really, really care about the quality of life and making a meaningful, socially significant difference for the individuals that we're serving, whether this is in an autism population or not, I mean, that's the very first part of applied behavior analysis, right? When we look back at, you know, when our field sort of shifted from just being an experimental analysis of behavior into this applied part, the very first of all the dimensions is applied. We're making a difference, you know, a socially significant difference. And so I think there's lots of ways we can do that. I just think this is one of the biggest ways, and one of the ways that we're just not talking about enough. And so I think we need to talk about it more. And so here we are. And I'm so grateful, because I think, When I first started getting interested in this area, even 5 years ago, nobody really was talking about sexuality teaching. And we were really getting good at teaching little kids skills in clinics, and that's important. But little kids turn into teenagers and turn into adults. And, in Ontario especially, we've seen how that's shifted over the last, 20 years that we've funded services for individuals on the spectrum. And we're not great at the teens and adults thing. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of kids that are coming that are going to be teens and adults. And so I think if we really want to do the best that we can, then we need to be thinking about meaningful programming. We need to be thinking about real life, and we need to be thinking about sexuality. And so, okay, here we are. I'm grateful that people want to do this. I'm grateful for every opportunity that I get to sit down with people like you, to speak at conferences, for everybody that comes and listens to this, because I think those are people that really are saying, hey, I care about this. And that's amazing. So I'm so grateful for all of that.
Amazing. Well, we're grateful for you, first and foremost. And I think if there's anything that people should take away from our conversation today, is that it's sexuality skills are critical. They're tough. You can't shy away from teaching them, right? You're either going to go head on and help support individuals in learning these skills. If you don't, we've talked a lot about what the byproducts of that are. But when you do, it makes a meaningful difference. It makes a meaningful, we are compelled to do so. I believe as a field, we are blessed to have the tools and the strategies to do it, so we can do it. But for anybody watching, whether it's families going, oh, I don't know if I can deal with this, or what can I do, or a clinician that's like, I'd rather not. It's like, look, if your client needs this, if your child needs this, we must do it. And thankfully, we have people like you. So for anybody watching too, I'll say, if you have an opportunity, wherever Dr. Jess Cauchi is, listen to her, okay? You've got amazing strategies and a roadmap for people to learn from. And if anything, what you've been doing, and your mentors like Dr. Peter Gerhardt, who I also love too, thankfully you are setting a roadmap here for people to have more conversations about this and for us all to do better. So thank you to you. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your insight. Thrilled to have you, and just keep doing what you're doing. And we all are so blessed to learn from you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to get to indulge this soapbox and talk about this. So thank you.
Awesome.